Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How you guys doing? Good, alhamdulillah. First of all, I want to be a little bit anecdotal. Usually I'm overly pseudo-intellectual in my approach, quasi-rational to use Abdurrahim Green's terms. But I want to start with an anecdote really. First of all, I want to say it's a great honor for me to be here because when I was a young man, maybe a young boy, actually I should say, when I was a boy, I remember I used to be a consumer, an avid consumer of the dawah material. So I used to watch Abdurrahim Green when I used to come home from school. I used to watch him. I used to watch Zakir Naik, Peace TV. I used to watch many of the mashayikh here. Adnan Rashid, I got to know about Adnan Rashid and Hamza Zorsis a little bit later on because they're not that much older than me. So when I was in university, I got to know who they were. So first of all, I find it a great honor to be, to be in the same stage and share the same platform as those individuals. And at that time, to be honest with you, when I used to go home from school, when I was a boy, and I used to go on YouTube, I used to watch the kind of back and forth between Muslims and the enemies of Islam. And I used to watch how the enemies of Islam and Muslims would both talk about the relationship between the Quran and science. And at that particular time when I was watching all of this happening, I found it highly interesting, but I also found it quite like a tug of war between the two parties. And at this stage, I was just a young man growing up, trying to make sense of truth and trying to actually find truth, to be honest with you, at this particular time. I wanted to know, because I was, let's say, 14, 15 years old. I wanted to know that, okay, if this is the true religion, I want to follow it. But if it's not the true religion, then there's a lot of things I can be doing in my life, enjoying myself and doing these things. So I want to make sure that this is the true religion so I can follow it. In a nutshell, that was my understanding. So I would watch the lectures of Abdurrahim Green, of Zakir Naik, of other popular speakers, and I would also watch the lectures of the enemies of Islam, which I'm not going to mention their names on this blessed place. But I'd actually be a consumer of both of these individuals. And when I grew up and grew older, I started realizing that on this issue of science and the Quran, both of them were making true points to some extent. I got a bit older, I was watching the Zakir Naik stuff. I used to love watching it. And then I thought to myself, yeah, he's saying this and he's saying this, but the enemies of Islam are saying these things. And they're both using the Quran and they're both using interpretations of the Quran. So I'm growing up and consuming all of this. When I got older, I thought to myself, I'm going to do my own research. And so I'm 28 now, so this was a good 14 years ago. So this is a 14-year-old research I'm giving you right now, in 10 minutes, And because I was genuinely interested in finding out to what extent either party was true. So the Zakir Naik narrative was kind of like the Quran has scientific miracles. And the Quran contains things in it which couldn't have been known at that particular time. Therefore, the Quran is from God because of that. And the enemies of Islam would project another narrative, which is that actually the Quran is completely unscientific. And these are the interpretations, and they would go into what you refer to as the Turath Islami, the traditions of Islam. And therefore, Islam is false. So as I was 14, 15, 16, I didn't know how to make sense because both of these two competing claims were actually had some elements of truth in them. So I would actually go to Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Tafsir Tabari in English because I didn't know how to access the Arabic at that time. And some of what the enemies of Islam were saying were true, and some of what Zakir Naik and those guys were saying was true as well. So I'm thinking, who is right in this, you see? So I decided to basically, if I'm going to have the strength to be able to come to a conclusion by myself, I need to learn the language and I need to understand, I need to access the primary text, which took me some time. So I was going to school. I'll tell you one time, I used to do boxing, Yes. And one time I had a good session. Sometimes I had a very bad session. I'll be honest, I had bad sessions and good sessions. One day I had a good session. And sometimes I get these delusions of grandeur. And I was standing at the bus stop, with my gym bag as a teenager, and I thought to myself, yeah, maybe one day I'll be the world heavyweight champion. No, wallahi, I actually got that for a second. I thought, yeah, why not? I've got good reach and this and that. I started to get delusions. And then, I tell you something, wallahi, yeah? I said, but I don't want to be the world heavyweight champion. Because how is that going to help me and people like me that are trying to discover the truth? So I said, I want to do what people like Abdurrahim Green are doing, people like Zakir Naik are doing. And then, alhamdulillah, 15 years later or whatever it is, 14 years later, I'm in the same podium, yeah, giving you guys what I learned in that 14 years on this issue. Basically, in summary, this is the reality. This is what I found out. What I found out in the last decade and a half of research is as follows. The Quran has verses in it which reference naturalistic phenomena. So for example, it talks about how the universe was created. It talks about different things about nature, the mountains, the seas, etc. That's what the Quran talks about. And it's meant to be taken literally. Like those verses which reference naturalistic phenomena are not in any way, shape or form seen to be majazi. In other words, we shouldn't be looking at them as metaphor. We should actually be looking at them as literal. Those verses though, can they be interpreted in a scientific manner which relates with the 21st century science? Yes and no. This is my conclusion. Going back to what the enemies of Islam were saying on the one hand and what the da'is were saying on the other. Actually, the same verse can have two interpretations, sometimes both going back to the Salaf, sometimes both of them going back to the Sahaba. One of them is legit in line with science and the other one is not. I'll give you one example just to give you a taste of this. There's a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah where it says that هو الذي جعل لكم ما في الأرض جميعا ثم استوى إلى السماء فسواهن سبع سماوات. That he's the one who created the earth and then he turned to the heaven and then he apportioned them into 7 heavens. Yeah. If you look at Tabari and what Ibn Abbas is narrated to have said, though there are some discussions about, I don't want to go into technicalities, you'll see that there is one qawl, one opinion that says that the earth was created before the universe, which is completely unscientific. That is totally unscientific. You can't say that the earth was created from the universe when the material of the universe is required for the earth to be created. Yeah, and especially if you're looking at something literalistically and not metaphorically, this would be out of line with science. However, because of the other verse, وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا, many of the Salaf also interpreted that the earth could be created after the universe. So there's a difference of opinion within the Salaf. And there's not only a difference of opinion within the Salaf, but there is a difference of opinion between the Mufassirun. Therefore, you can adopt an opinion which is in line with science or out of line with science. You can legitimately, as a Mufassir, as an exegete, come to a conclusion which the Islamophobe or these enemies of Islam were trying to use. Yeah? Or you can come to a conclusion which the du'at were trying to use. But neither have the full right to say this is exactly what the verse means, bila munaza'a, or without any discussion, because there is a discussion. And what I want to bring to you guys' attention, and this is a very important point about scientific miracles discourse from an exegetical perspective, from a tafsiri perspective, is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He references verses, like for example, كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. This is very well known, chapter 21, verse 30, Surah Al-Anbiya, where the heavens and the earth were one piece and then Allah cleft them asunder, so on. Could this mean the Big Bang? I mean, it's not, I'm not saying it is the Big Bang, I'm not saying it isn't the Big Bang, but what I'm saying is, you can make an argument either way, which doesn't contradict, yes? Which doesn't contradict the early Salaf. You can make an argument either way, and you can be convincing either way. But you can't say that there's one interpretation of this verse. I'll give you one last example. One last example is that the shape of the earth. The shape of the earth in the Quran, the majority of scholars like for example, Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, they looked at verses like يكور الليل على النهار ويكور النهار على الليل وسخر الشمس والقمر كل يجري لأجل مسمى, chapter 39 verse 5. And they looked at those verses and thought, there's no way that he rolls the day into the night and he rolls the night into the day unless the earth itself was round. Ibn Hazm said that 1,000 years ago or so, yeah? In fact, Ahmad ibn Hanbal said that. In fact, the Salaf said that. So some people from the Sahaba and the Salaf said the earth is round. But it's true that we have in our tradition some Islamic scholars that said it was flat, and they used verses from the Quran to say it was flat. Do you understand? So what I'm saying is, when you strip the nuances, if I were to come here and present just what one side said and what the other side didn't say, what would be problematic is that when you're going to the other side, the counter argument, then you would be exposed to all of that other stuff which is unscientific, and you would think it's a counter argument to the scientific explanation. The point is, both explanations are possible. You can interpret the Quran in a way which is fully compliant, and this is my point. You can interpret the Quran in a way which is fully compliant with our cosmological picture of the 21st century. I can tell you that after my research has been complete. Yeah, I'm telling you, you can. And you can get salaf for everything. I can get you interpretations for everything. But you can also interpret the Quran in a way which is totally contradictory to the scientific understanding of the 21st century. And this is using the same exegetical methods, the same tafsiri approach, and so on and so forth. What we don't have the right to do is insist on the scientific explanation. That's what we don't have the right to do that. Just like the disbelievers or the enemies of Islam don't have the right to insist on the unscientific explanation. But we have to be agnostic, as it were. We have to be quite, uncertain, as it were, because the reality is, and this goes to the next part, science itself is uncertain. And this is from the great work of Hamza Zorsis. In fact, to be honest, I was looking at who actually contributed to this from a literary perspective. In the Arab world, the most notable person is someone called Masa'ad al-Tayyar, who wrote a book, Al-A'jaz al-Ilm fi al-Quran, or the scientific miracle of the Quran. To what point? And he concluded basically that you can't do eisegesis, or what eisegesis is superimpose meanings onto the Quran. You can't do that. That's not allowed. So those du'at that do that are going against the methods, because you're not allowed to just say, okay, well, this is what the verse means, and I'm going to superimpose it like that. But so that's one thing you can't do. You have to go back to the Sahaba of how the Quran was interpreted. He deals with it from more tafsir perspective. Hamza Zorsis himself has written an article about what he refers to as the multidimensional approach. And that multidimensional approach is an approach basically which says this, that like I just said, the Quran can be interpreted in a way which can facilitate scientific explanations of the 21st century and non-scientific explanations of, say, the 8th, 9th, 10th century or so on. And this he refers to as the multidimensional approach. He refers to this as a multidimensional approach. Now, here's the thing. I think this is exactly correct. I think this, if anything is going to be referred to as a proof of Islam or used as a proof of Islam, is the ability for the Quran, and this is the argument here, the ability for the Quran, number one, to be, interpreted literalistically, whilst still, number two, having a multidimensional or multifaceted interpretive scope. In such a way as that I, say for example here in the 21st century in 2019, can interpret the Quran to a large extent in line with current scientific discourse, and someone in the 8th, 9th or 10th century could have done the same thing. This is the bottom line. So, what the Arab kind of academics have done is help us with like the exegetical understanding. But really, if you want more understanding of how this works, visit Hamza Zorsis' his article on it, because it will give you more of the philosophy of science perspective. Because the philosophy of science is different to science. By the way, you can study philosophy of science in university. It's something you do on a degree level, master's degree level, you can all the way up. And what they'll tell you in a class in philosophy of science is simply that we can't be certain about science. That's what they'll tell you. Even that which is referred to as scientific fact or scientific certainty, you can't be sure about it. So from that perspective, it took me a long time to come to this conclusion because I basically looked at all of the examples that were used on both sides. And I looked at the fact that basically all of them can be interpreted in a way which is scientific or non-scientific, with the exception of one, which is the fact that Adam could have been evolved from, so he has a common ancestor with other primates, etc. That is something you can't reconcile. But the data can be reconciled, frankly. The fact that you have the evolutionary scope, that's not a real problem for us. Or the fact that species can evolve or something, that's not an issue for us. The Quran doesn't go against these issues. Even the fact that you have hominids, listen, even the fact that you have hominids that are, 500,000 years old is not a problem for us. Yeah, because we don't say that they're connected to Adam. There are some tafasir, like Tabari himself, who died 324, if I'm correct. He said that there were pre-Adamic creatures, called al-bun, and that they existed before Adam, and they used a lot of them. The ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, تجعل فيها ما يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك. Who are you going to put in it? Who creates corruption in it and sheds blood? They say, what kind of creature is this? It might have been a pre-Adamic creature who existed, has the ability, if they're shedding blood, they have the ability to wield some kind of tool or some kind of thing. Yeah. So we don't have a problem with the pre-Adamic creatures, but we have a problem with connecting the hominids with Adam. And there's no way, either way, anyone can falsify what we're saying or what they're saying, because it's a speculative thing. Paleontology, which is the field of digging up these fossils and trying to find out those fossils, trying to find out how evolution worked out, is a speculative science to a large extent, like archaeology, just like archaeology is from a historical perspective. Therefore, there's no way anyone can say this is the way it is and this way it isn't. But apart from this, apart from Adam or the Adam narrative, there's nothing else which you'll find, okay, this is a real tension. Bikhilaf, the Bible, and this is where I want to end. And this is, subhanAllah, something where you can make an argument. If you look at the biblical discourse, especially the Old Testament biblical discourse, you'll find there mufassirun, especially what's referred to as midrash. Now, midrash is the old tafsir of the Jews, the rabbinic tafsir of Genesis. Look at Genesis and Psalms. You'll see that they also believe, the Jews of the Old Testament, when they were doing tafsir, that this is literal. But the Old Testament scriptures have no way of being multidimensional in the same way as the Quran is. So we say that the Quran can facilitate a 21st century understanding just like it can facilitate a 7th or 8th century understanding of the cosmos, whereas the Old Testament discourse cannot facilitate both. I'll give you one example. For example, in the Bible, in the book of Job, it says that the earth has pillars. The closest thing you're going to find in the Bible to the earth being round is the circle of the earth. There's nothing, literalistically, if you're going to read the Bible in a literalistic way, there's nothing in the Bible that says that the earth is round or alludes to it in any way, shape, or form. Therefore, if you are going to take a literalistic understanding of the Bible, you must conclude the earth is flat and that it has pillars. You have to conclude that. So, whereas in the Quranic discourse, you can conclude that the earth is flat or that the earth is round. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah said this, ijma' of the ulama, that the earth is round. Al-Juwayni said this as well. Al-Ghazali said that as well. Ibn Hazm said that as well. Ahmad ibn Hanbal said that as well. In fact, the Salaf. So we have people that came the pre-modern era who concluded both things. Whereas in their exegesis, we only find the unscientific explanation. Therefore, comparative to other religious texts, the Quran is a timeless revelation from a naturalistic perspective. The Quran is well and truly timeless. This is the argument, that comparative to the biblical text, or any other text, ancient text for that matter, where the Quran can facilitate a modern understanding and a non-scientific understanding, these other texts can only facilitate a non-scientific understanding if all of the evidences are put in collection with each other, in totality with each other. Therefore, I would say, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that, no, the Quran doesn't make mention to anything naturalistic, because that's not true. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about nature, He speaks in truth. أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. Does he not know what he created and he is the all-subtle, all-aware? Allah says in the Quran. So whenever Allah speaks about nature, he speaks about it in truth. However, the interpretation of his aqwal is subject to interpretation. That's why it says وَمِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله. In chapter 3 verse 7 where it says that there are some verses which are clear and which are some other ones which are ambiguous. And as for those who have disease in their heart, they'll follow the ambiguous ones looking for fitna. And we've had that fitna before in the past where the Mu'tazilis, a sect of Islam, used Aristotelian logic to try and do eisegesis, not exegesis. Eisegesis is superimposition of other meanings from other ideologies and backgrounds onto the Quranic text. And now the fitna is taking the scientism approach. So some people now, they're basically not scientific, but scientism is the idea that science can explain everything. And they're doing the same thing. So we have to be careful of that. So in a nutshell, the way to understand this is, to summarize, number one, those verses that are talking in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and those ahadith in the Sunnah that talk about the scientific phenomena may be interpreted in a scientific way and may not be. But the fact that both are possible interpretations shows you the validity and the timelessness and the multidimensional, to use Hamza Zor's term, nature of the Quranic interpretation comparative to biblical texts or other ancient texts. So we have to be careful when it comes to science. But if you understand those general principles, inshallah, you should be fine. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.